I paid a stranger to pretend to be my wealthy fiancé at my brother's restaurant launch, strictly because my ex-husband was attending to review the place alongside the woman he drained my savings for. But what my rented date did during the ribbon-cutting ceremony made every journalist in the room drop their pens. The exact second I knew I was permanently damaged was when a guy I'd met 7 minutes ago in a Starbucks parking lot told me my emerald dress was stunning, and I blurted out it was on clearance. He didn't chuckle. He just stared across the console with a hollow, pitying expression, like watching a dog flinch from a rolled-up newspaper. His name was Declan. I'd booked him at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday through an app called Elite Escorts, transferring him $450 for 4 hours. I needed a buffer, someone who looked at me like I held a winning lottery ticket, specifically so Reed would see it when I walked into Bistro 42. Let me rewind. My dad suffered a stroke when I was 24, and my brother Kai was barely in high school, so I took over the family bakery. I paid the mortgage, funded Kai's culinary school, and handled every audit. When Kai asked me to be the sole co-owner of his new flagship restaurant, it was the first time in 12 years I felt my sacrifices meant something. I had been married to Reed for a decade, and he treated my ambition like a localized infection. If I bought a new car, he'd say, "Let's not pretend you're a CEO, Iris." If I mentioned expanding, he'd smirk and mutter, "Always trying to punch above your weight class." I was conditioned to shrink myself before he could. The marriage imploded when I answered a call at 2:14 p.m. on a Wednesday. It was a Lexus dealership in Chicago, confirming the delivery address for the luxury SUV Reed just purchased using our joint savings. The address belonged to a 25-year-old Pilates instructor named Petra. Reed was attending the grand opening because he was the senior food critic for the Tribune. The PR team insisted we couldn't ban him without causing a scene. So, enter Declan. He met me wearing a tailored navy suit. I apologized for my makeup being rushed. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "You deflect every compliment before it even hits you." Inside, I spent the first hour downplaying my existence. The head waitress praised the custom mahogany tables I'd spent 3 weeks sanding, and I said, "The wood did most of the work." An investor commended the menu I curated, and I pointed to Kai. Declan intervened every time. "She spent 80 hours on those tables." "Acknowledge it, Iris." Reed swaggered over with Petra clinging to his arm. He inspected Declan with narrowed eyes before announcing, "Well, Iris, surprised you found someone willing to endure your neurotic little projects. Must be exhausting pretending to be important." Declan stepped into Reed's personal space. "She doesn't pretend, but it's fascinating how quickly you try to make her feel small. I've known her an hour, and I can already smell your insecurities." The real showdown happened during the ribbon cutting. I tried to push Kai forward to take the microphone alone, whispering, "They don't care about the money, girl." Kai grabbed my wrist, pulling me front and center. "Stand here, Iris. Claim your work." I held the microphone, palms sweating, and mumbled, "I just handled the paperwork." Kai is the genius here. From the front row of the press pit, Reed laughed. "Stick to the spreadsheets, Iris. Leave the spotlight to the talent." The flashbulbs paused. Declan stepped onto the small riser. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "For 10 years, you manipulated this woman into believing her relentless hard work was just background noise. She financed this entire operation while you drained her bank accounts to buy luxury cars for your mistress. So tell me, Reed, does tearing down the architect make you feel better about being nothing but a critic?" Dead silence. Reed flushed a dark crimson, glancing around as the other journalists stared at him in disgust. Petra took a step away from him, her eyes wide with humiliation. Kai took the microphone back. "My sister mortgaged her life for this place. She is the foundation of this restaurant, and I won't let anyone pretend otherwise." He handed me the giant ceremonial scissors. "Cut it, Iris." I felt that familiar urge to apologize, to hand the scissors back, to say it was too much. But I looked at Reed, shrinking under the judgment of his peers, and for the first time, I let the urge die. I gripped the heavy brass handles, smiled at the cameras, and sliced the ribbon. As the crowd erupted into applause, my phone buzzed once in my pocket. I glanced down without thinking, and the name on the screen stopped my breath cold. Reed's lawyer, a single text reading. "We need to talk about what Petra found in your father's old files." The screen went dark, but the words stayed burned into my retinas. Silas Mercer. That was the lawyer's name. A ruthless, bill-by-the-minute divorce attorney who made a living out of financial autopsies. My thumb hovered over the glass. The applause in the room was deafening, bouncing off the exposed brick and high-tin ceilings of Kai's restaurant. People were cheering for me, for us, but I was entirely frozen, the heavy brass scissors slipping slightly in my sweaty grip. Declan noticed. Of course he did. His job was observation. He stepped close, his shoulder brushing mine, and seamlessly took the scissors from my hand before I dropped them. "Smile," he murmured, his voice pitched so low only I could hear it. "3 cameras are still on you. Look at your brother." I forced my head to turn. I stretched my mouth into a shape that felt like a smile. Kai wrapped an arm around my shoulders and squeezed, completely oblivious to the ice water currently replacing my blood. "We did it," Kai said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it," I echoed. My voice sounded hollow. Across the room, Reed was already moving toward the exit. He didn't look back. Petra was trailing a few steps behind him, her head down, her posture tight and defensive. They pushed through the heavy glass doors and disappeared into the Chicago night. The rest of the evening was a blur of handshakes, spilled champagne, and polite nods. I let Declan lead me through the motions. He played his part flawlessly, a protective, adoring barrier between me and the investors who wanted to pick my brain about profit margins. Every time my phone vibrated in my clutch, my stomach turned over. I didn't check it again. I couldn't. At 1:15 a.m., the last of the PR team packed up their ring lights and left. The waitstaff were stacking chairs. Kai was in the kitchen with his sous chef doing a final inventory check. I stood by the coat check, wrapping my wool coat over the clearance emerald dress. Declan stood beside me, adjusting his watch. Our 4 hours were up an hour ago. I owe you for the overtime, I said, digging into my bag for my phone to open Venmo. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys on the floor. Declan knelt and picked them up. He didn't hand them back right away. He just looked at me. I don't want your overtime pay. Iris, what was on your phone? Nothing. I lied instinctively. You cut a ribbon, looked at a screen, and turned the color of wet concrete. It wasn't nothing. I swallowed hard. My ex-husband's lawyer. He sent a text. Saying what? I hesitated. I didn't owe this man anything. He was a transaction. But tonight, he was the only person who had looked at me without wanting something from me, saying they found something in my father's old files. And it was found by Petra. Declan's brow furrowed. The mistress? Why would she have access to your father's files? The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had to lean against the coat check counter, because before she was a Pilates instructor, she was an undergrad accounting student. 3 years ago, Reed got her a summer internship at my family's bakery. Declan let out a slow, quiet breath. She did your books. She organized the back office, I whispered, the memory suddenly sharp and suffocating. Petra sitting in my dad's old leather chair, drinking iced coffee, filing 7 years of chaotic post-stroke medical debt and tax returns. She had access to everything. The property deeds, the loan structures, everything. Iris, Declan said, his voice losing that polished professional edge for the first time all night. What did your father do? I don't know, I said, panic finally rising into my throat. I took over the finances when he got sick, but the old debts, I just paid the monthly minimums. I never dug into the origins. I was 24. I was just trying to keep the lights on. Declan handed me my keys. His expression was unreadable. Call the lawyer. First thing tomorrow. Don't wait for them to set the trap. He walked me to my car, waited until my doors were locked, and walked away into the damp night air. I drove home in absolute silence, the text message sitting in my inbox like an unexploded bomb. I didn't sleep. At 8:01 a.m., I sat at my kitchen island, staring at the gray morning light filtering through the blinds, and dialed Silas Mercer's office. His paralegal put me through immediately. Iris, Silas said. His voice was smooth, expensive, and entirely devoid of warmth. I figured you'd call early. What do you want, Silas? The divorce is finalized. The assets were split. I bought him out of his share of the house. We are done. We are done with the marital estate, yes, Silas agreed. The sound of paper shuffling echoed through the receiver. But we are not done with the commercial liabilities, specifically the deed to the property at 419 West Elm, the bakery. I own the bakery, I said. My father transferred the deed to me 5 years ago. He did, Silas said. But what he didn't tell you, and what Petra so diligently uncovered while doing your filing back in 2023, is that 11 years ago, when your father's medical bills were piling up, he took out a private commercial loan against the building. A substantial one. $250,000. I gripped the edge of the counter. I pay that loan every month. It's factored into the operating costs. Yes, you pay the interest, Silas corrected gently. But did you ever look at the original loan agreement, Iris? Did you look at the guarantor signatures? A cold sweat broke out across my collarbones. What are you saying? Your father's credit was ruined by the hospital bills. The bank wouldn't touch him, so he went to a private lender, and he needed a co-signer with pristine credit and a verifiable income. I closed my eyes. No, Reed co-signed the loan. Iris, 11 years ago. He is legally liable for the $250,000 lien on your family's bakery, a liability that was not disclosed during the divorce proceedings because, conveniently, neither you nor your father mentioned it. Reed knew. I yelled, my voice cracking. He signed it. He knew about it. Reed claims he forgot, Silas said smoothly. He signed many documents for your family over the years, but now that he has been reminded, he is entirely uncomfortable carrying a massive financial liability for an ex-wife, especially one who goes out of her way to publicly humiliate him in front of the Chicago press. My stomach bottomed out. The stunt, the ribbon cutting, Declan ripping him apart in front of the Tribune writers. Reed wasn't just embarrassed, he was out for blood. What does he want? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The loan has a demand clause, Silas said. The guarantor can request to be released, which requires the loan to be paid in full immediately. If you cannot produce $250,000 in 30 days, the lender will foreclose on the building. I stopped breathing. If the bakery went under, the collateral I used to secure Kai's restaurant loans would vanish. Both businesses would collapse. My entire life, my brother's future, my dad's legacy, wiped out. There's an alternative, of course, Silas added, his tone conversational. What? Reed will assume the debt himself. He'll pay off the lender. Silas paused, letting the weight of the offer hang in the air. In exchange for the deed to the bakery, you can stay on as a tenant, Iris. He's willing to offer you a very reasonable lease. Reed didn't just want to hurt me. He wanted to own me. He wanted to walk into the building I had bled for over the last 12 years and collect rent. I'll have my lawyer review this, I choked out and hung up the phone. I sat in the silence of my kitchen. The emerald dress was draped over a chair in the corner. I had spent a decade shrinking myself to keep Reed comfortable. Last night, for 4 hours, I had finally stood up, and today, I was going to lose everything because of it. My phone vibrated again. A text from an unknown number. Did you call him? It was Declan. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed back, he wants the bakery. 3 dots appeared immediately. Then a reply, I'm coming over. I didn't type anything back. 20 minutes later, a heavy knock rattled my front door. When I pulled it open, Declan was standing on my porch. He had swapped the tailored navy suit for dark jeans and a faded charcoal sweatshirt. He didn't look like an elite escort anymore. He looked like a guy who had just rolled out of bed to help a friend move a couch. He was holding 2 large black coffees. He walked in without waiting for an invitation, kicked his boots off by the mat, and handed me one of the cups. Drink, he said. I took it. The heat of the cardboard sleeve grounded me just a fraction of an inch. I pointed to the living room floor, where I had already dragged 3 heavy cardboard banker's boxes out from the hall closet. They were dusty and smelled like old basement air. My dad's records, I said, my voice hoarse. From the stroke to when I officially took over the LLC. Declan sat down on the rug right next to the boxes. He pulled the lid off the first one. What's the lender's name? I don't know, I said, dropping down beside him. Silas didn't say. He just said it was a private commercial loan from 11 years ago. We look for anything notarized in 2015, Declan said. He handed me a stack of manila folders. Check the dates. Don't read the pages, just scan the top right corners for the year. We sat in silence for 45 minutes. The only sound was the rustle of stiff yellowing paper and the occasional thud of a folder being tossed into the discard pile. It felt surreal. Less than 12 hours ago, this man was pretending to be my wealthy fiancé, tearing my ex-husband apart in front of the Chicago press. Now he was sitting on my cheap IKEA rug, sifting through my family's financial trauma. Got it, Declan said suddenly. I dropped the stack I was holding. He was holding a thick packet stapled down the left side, the blue ink of a notary stamp visible on the final page. I leaned over his shoulder. At the top of the first page, in bold black letters, it read, Promissory Note and Commercial Pledge Agreement. The lender was listed as Oak Creek Holdings, LLC. The principal amount was $250,000. And there, on the very last page, under my dad's shaky post-stroke signature, was another signature. Crisp, arrogant, and perfectly legible. Reed Halverson. He really signed it, I whispered, feeling the last bit of oxygen leave the room. He knew this whole time. Through the entire divorce. While we were negotiating the buyout of the house, he knew he had a $250,000 guillotine waiting to drop on my neck. Declan's finger traced down the page, stopping at a dense paragraph of legalese. It gets worse. How could it possibly get worse? Look at this clause, Declan said, his voice flat. He tapped the paper. In the event of default and subsequent foreclosure, the guarantor, that's Reed, holds the right of first refusal to purchase the property from the lender for the balance of the outstanding debt. I stared at the words until they blurred. What does that mean? It means, Declan said, looking up at me, that if you can't pay the $250,000 in 30 days, the lender seizes the bakery. And Reed has a legally binding contract allowing him to buy it directly from the lender for exactly what is owed. He bypasses the public auction. He steals a commercial building in a prime Chicago neighborhood for a fraction of its market value. A cold, heavy nausea settled in my stomach. Reed wasn't just being petty. He wasn't just trying to punish me for the restaurant launch. This was a calculated financial ambush. He was going to take the bakery, the only thing that kept my family afloat, and he was going to do it completely legally. I have to go to work, I said, standing up so fast the room spun. Iris, Declan said, standing up with me. You haven't slept. I have to open the bakery, I repeated, walking toward the hallway to grab my coat. Nora gets there at 5 to start the dough, but I have to do the cash drop. I have to open the doors. If I don't open the doors, we don't make money, and I suddenly need $250,000. Declan didn't try to stop me. He just picked up his keys from the console table. I'll drive. You don't have to do this, I said, turning to face him. You were hired for a 4-hour event. The event is over. I don't have the money to keep paying you. Declan looked at me, his eyes dark and entirely unreadable. Put your coat on, Iris. We drove to the bakery in silence. The sun was just starting to burn through the morning fog, casting a pale gray light over the brick buildings of the West Loop. When we pulled up to 419 West Elm, the familiar smell of yeast, brown sugar, and roasting coffee hit me before I even unlocked the front door. It was the smell of my entire adult life. Nora, my head baker, was already behind the counter, wiping down the pastry glass. She looked up and smiled, wiping flour on her apron. Morning, boss. How was the big launch? It was great, I lied smoothly, the instinct to protect my staff kicking in. Sold out night. Kai did amazing. I knew he would. She beamed, then glanced at Declan. Who's this? A friend, I said. He's just keeping me company for a bit. Nora went back to the kitchen, and I walked into the small back office. I sat down at the desk, the exact same desk where Petra had sat 3 years ago, drinking iced coffee and organizing the files that would eventually be used to ruin me. Declan leaned against the doorframe watching me boot up the computer. What's the plan? I'm going to look up Oak Creek Holdings, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. If they're a local private lender, maybe I can negotiate. Show them our revenue. Prove we're good for the monthly payments. Maybe I can refinance the loan through a traditional bank and cut Reed out entirely. You have 30 days, Declan reminded me gently. Commercial refinancing takes 60 to 90, assuming your debt-to-income ratio is perfect, which, because you secured Kai's restaurant loans against this business, it isn't. I closed my eyes. He was right. On paper, I was over-leveraged. No traditional bank would touch me fast enough to beat Reed's clock. Before I could reply, the bell above the front door jingled. We're not open for another 20 minutes. Nora called out from the kitchen. I stood up and walked out of the office to lock the door. But the person standing in the center of the bakery wasn't an early morning commuter looking for a croissant. It was Petra. She was wearing a long beige trench coat, her hair pulled back into a messy clip. She looked pale, the heavy makeup from the night before scrubbed clean, leaving dark circles under her eyes. She flinched when she saw me, taking a half step backward toward the door. Declan stepped out of the office behind me. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. What are you doing here? I asked, keeping my voice low so Nora wouldn't hear. Petra swallowed hard, her eyes darting between me and Declan. I need to talk to you, Iris. Please. You did enough talking when you were going through my dad's files, I said, the anger finally breaking through the panic. You handed Reed the gun. I didn't know what it was. Petra blurted out, her voice cracking. I swear to God, Iris, when I was an intern here, I just flagged the loan because it had a balloon interest rate. I thought I was helping fix your books. I told Reed about it because he was your husband. I thought he would help you refinance it. He used it to extort me, I said coldly. I know, she whispered. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, looking impossibly young and entirely defeated. I didn't know until this morning. When we got back from the restaurant last night, he was furious. He started drinking. shocking. He called Silas Mercer at 2 in the morning and told him to pull the trigger on the bakery. Why are you telling me this? Petra looked down at the hexagonal tile floor. Because last night, when your friend, she glanced at Declan when he said Reed tears down the architect because he's just a critic. Reed lost it. He told me I was useless. He told me if I had just kept my mouth shut and looked pretty, he wouldn't have been humiliated. She looked back up at me, and I saw genuine tears welling in her eyes. He doesn't love me, Iris. He just liked that I wasn't you. I didn't challenge him, but I was listening to him talk on the phone last night, and you need to know something. He isn't keeping this building to collect rent. The air in the bakery felt suddenly very still. What do you mean? Oak Creek Holdings, Petra said, her voice shaking. It's not a real lending company. It's a shell LLC managed by a commercial real estate developer named Pierce Whitfield. Reed plays golf with him. They've been talking for 6 months. Declan stepped forward, his posture rigid. Talking about what? The zoning laws on this block changed last year, Petra said, looking at me. Reed doesn't want the bakery. He's going to foreclose on the debt, trigger his right of first refusal, and immediately sell the lot to Pierce Whitfield for $3 million. They're going to tear your father's building down and put up luxury condos. I stared at her. The smell of yeast and roasting coffee suddenly turned my stomach, rising up my throat like battery acid. $3 million. He wasn't just trying to bankrupt me. He was going to pave over my father's life, demolish the kitchen where I learned to knead dough when I was 9 years old, and walk away with a 7-figure payout. Declan crossed his arms, his jaw tight. That's why the demand clause was triggered so fast. They need the property now, before the zoning laws shift again or the local alderman freezes new developments. Pierce Whitfield is notorious for fast-tracking demolition permits. How do you know that? I asked, my voice barely working. I read the Financial Times, Iris, Declan said dryly. He looked back at Petra. You've got a lot of nerve walking in here, Petra. You basically loaded the gun for him, and now you're upset because the recoil bruised your shoulder. Petra flinched, pulling her trench coat tighter around herself. I didn't know. I swear. I left him, Iris. I packed a bag this morning while he was in the shower. I can't be with someone who does things like this. Congratulations on your sudden moral awakening, I said. My hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the edge of the pastry case. But leaving him doesn't fix my problem. It doesn't pay off $250,000 in 30 days. So unless you have a checkbook in that coat, get out of my bakery. She opened her mouth, closed it, and backed toward the door. The bell jingled a cheerful, mocking sound as she pulled it open and stepped out into the gray Chicago morning. I stood frozen behind the counter. The espresso machine hissed in the background. Nora was humming in the kitchen, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath her feet was essentially gone. 30 days, I whispered. We have 30 days to find $250,000 in cash. Not just cash, Declan corrected, his voice maddeningly calm. Liquid cash. Unencumbered. Because if Oak Creek Holdings is a shell for Pierce Whitfield, they aren't going to accept a payment plan. They will refuse any attempt you make to refinance through a traditional lender. They will drag their feet on the paperwork until the 30 days expire, force the default, and trigger Reed's right of first refusal. The only way you beat them is by dropping a certified check on Silas Mercer's desk on day 29. I sank onto a stool behind the register. I don't have it. My savings are gone. Reed took them for his car and his apartment. Everything I've made in the last 2 years went into collateralizing the loan for Kai's restaurant. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Kai, if I lost the bakery, the collateral for Bistro 42 vanished. The bank would immediately call Kai's commercial loan. The restaurant we just launched, the one that had every food critic in Chicago raving last night, would be shuttered before they even finished printing the autumn menus. I have to tell Kai, I said, my chest tightening. I have to tell him we're dead in the water. No, Declan said sharply. You don't panic. You don't burn the house down before the fire even reaches the porch. We look at the original loan document again. He walked back into the small office and I followed him, my legs feeling like lead. He pulled the dusty manila folder out of the banker's box and spread the promissory note flat on the desk. He leaned over it, tracing the lines of text with a pen. Look at this, Declan said, tapping the second page. Clause 4B, the guarantor release clause. I squinted at the dense legal jargon. It says the guarantor can request release upon 90 days written notice, provided the primary borrower has not defaulted on any scheduled payments. Exactly, 90 days, Declan said, looking up at me. Silas Mercer told you on the phone that you had 30 days. Why? I frowned, trying to force my panicked brain to process the words. Because, he lied, to scare me into signing over the deed faster? Lawyers like Silas don't lie about timelines that are printed in black and white. It's a disbarment risk, Declan said, his eyes narrowing. They manipulate them, which means Reed didn't just decide to do this last night after the restaurant launch. If the clock is at 30 days now, he filed the paperwork to trigger the demand clause 60 days ago. The betrayal ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. 60 days ago. 2 months. Reed had been sitting on this while we finalized the last of the divorce paperwork. He had been planning to steal the bakery while I was negotiating the buyout of our house, while I was sanding the mahogany tables for Kai, while I was breathing sighs of relief that I was finally free of him. He had smiled at me in mediation, knowing he had a knife aimed squarely at my spine. He set it up perfectly, I said, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. He waited until Kai's restaurant launched. He knew the bakery was the collateral. He timed it so that if I fight him, he takes both businesses down. Declan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and frowned. He hit ignore and slid it back into his jeans. We need to talk to a lawyer who doesn't work for your ex-husband, a real estate litigator, someone who can file an injunction against Oak Creek Holdings. With what money? I asked. Good litigators require a $10,000 retainer. I literally just dropped my last available $500 on you last night. Declan looked at me for a long moment. Consider me on retainer. Declan, stop. Stop, you're an escort. You get paid to go to dinners and pretend to care. You don't need to involve yourself in a commercial real estate war with a millionaire developer. I told you last night, he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping an octave. I don't like watching people get made to feel small. And right now, Reed is trying to crush you. I'm not leaving. Before I could argue, my own phone started ringing. It was Kai. I stared at the screen, my stomach tying itself into a frantic knot. I answered it, putting it on speaker so Declan could hear. Hey Kai, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Congratulations on last night. Iris, are you at the bakery? Kai's voice wasn't celebratory. It was tight, panicked, and echoing, like he was pacing in an empty room. Yes, I'm here. What's wrong? I just got a call from Jack Durbin at First National, Kai said, the words spilling out in a frantic rush. He's the underwriter for the restaurant's business loan. He said he received an automated lien alert on our collateral file this morning. My blood ran completely cold. An alert? He said a notice of default was filed against the deed for the bakery at 8 a.m. This morning, Kai said, his voice cracking. Iris, what is going on? Jack froze our operating accounts. I was supposed to pay the meat purveyors today. The bank won't release the funds because they said the collateral securing our loan is in active foreclosure. Reed hadn't just filed the demand. He had weaponized the banking system. By officially filing the notice of default with the county clerk first thing in the morning, he had triggered an automated red flag on Kai's loan. Reed was choking us out immediately. Kai, listen to me, I said, my voice shaking. It's a mistake. It's an old debt of Dad's. Reed's name is on it, and he's trying to force a sale. I'm fixing it. Fixing it how? Kai yelled. Iris, I have a dining room booked solid for the next 3 weeks. If I can't pay the vendors by noon tomorrow, they don't deliver. If they don't deliver, we don't open. If we don't open our second week, we're dead. The critics will crucify us. I know, I said, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. Give me 24 hours. I will figure this out. Just stall the vendors. Jack wants a meeting, Kai said, sounding completely defeated. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. at the bank. He said if you can't provide proof that the lien is being cleared, they are calling the restaurant's loan. All of it. I'll be there. I promised. Just hold on, Kai. I hung up the phone and dropped my face into my hands. The walls of the tiny office felt like they were shrinking, closing in on me. 12 years of 60-hour work weeks, of sacrificing my 20s, of enduring Reed's constant belittling, all of it, gone in a single morning because of a signature from 2015. I felt a heavy hand settle on my shoulder. I looked up. Declan wasn't looking at me with pity anymore. He was looking at me with a cold, terrifying focus. Tomorrow at 9, he said. It doesn't matter. I choked out. We can't prove the lien is clearing because it isn't. Reed has won. He starved us out in less than 2 hours. Reed plays golf with Pierce Whitfield, Declan said softly, picking up the promissory note again. He operates in back rooms and country clubs. He thinks he's untouchable because he hides behind shell companies and expensive lawyers. He is untouchable, I said. No, Declan said, pulling his phone back out. He dialed a number and held it to his ear. His eyes locked onto mine. Nobody is untouchable when you find the right wire to cut. He waited a beat, then spoke into the phone. The polished, escort persona was entirely gone. His voice was sharp, authoritative, and accustomed to giving orders. Fletcher, Declan said, I need a favor. I need you to pull the incorporation documents for Oak Creek Holdings LLC. Yes, the Chicago one. I need every board member, every silent partner, and every financial disclosure tied to Pierce Whitfield. And I need it in an hour. He hung up the phone and looked at me. Who was that? I asked, my heart pounding against my ribs. Declan, who are you? He folded the promissory note and slid it into his jacket pocket. Let's just say, he said quietly, Reed isn't the only one who knows how to ruin someone on paper. I just stared at him. The hum of the bakery refrigerators felt deafening in the tiny office. You're an escort, I said, the words sounding completely ridiculous now. I booked you on an app. You showed up in a Starbucks parking lot. I'm a consultant, Declan corrected, leaning back against the edge of the desk. I specialize in distressed asset management and corporate restructuring. Or, I used to, before I burned out and realized I hated everyone in my tax bracket. Now I charge rich people exorbitant hourly rates to attend their boring galas. And occasionally I take a booking from someone who just needs a buffer against an asshole. He didn't smile. He just checked his watch. Fletcher was my lead analyst at my old firm. He knows how to read the plumbing of a shell company. If Pierce Whitfield set up Oak Creek Holdings to hide his involvement, there will be a seam. We just have to find it. And then what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We can't sue a millionaire developer in 30 days. We don't have to sue him. We just have to make the bakery too toxic for him to touch, Declan said. Real estate developers like Whitfield hate exposure. They rely on the process being quiet. If we can prove collusion between Reed and Whitfield to artificially trigger a foreclosure, we can file an injunction. It won't clear the debt, but it will freeze the 30-day clock. It buys us time. Time to do what? Time to go to the bank and stop them from bankrupting your brother. At 8:45 am the next morning, I walked through the heavy glass doors of First National Bank in the Loop. The air conditioning was freezing, smelling of polished marble and stale ozone. Kai was already there, pacing near the teller line. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His chef's coat was wrinkled, his hair a mess, and he was chewing aggressively on the inside of his cheek. When he saw me, he rushed over, his eyes darting to Declan, who was walking half a step behind me in a charcoal suit he'd presumably pulled from whatever high-end closet he maintained. Who is this? Kai demanded, his voice tight with panic. Iris, I told you it was just supposed to be us and Jack. The bank is already spooked. He's my financial advisor, I said, the lie slipping out easily. He's here to help. Kai, breathe. I can't breathe, Iris. We had a line of people around the block last night. A line. And today I had to tell my prep cooks we might not have a payroll run on Friday. What is going on with Dad's building? I'm fixing it, I said, putting a hand on his arm. I could feel the tension vibrating through his muscles. Just let me do the talking. A young assistant in a Navy suit approached us and led us to a glass-walled conference room in the back of the branch. Jack Durbin was already sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. He was a man in his late 50s with thin hair and a tie that looked too tight for his neck, but he wasn't alone. Sitting in the chair to Jack's right, casually scrolling through his phone, was Silas Mercer. I stopped in the doorway. My stomach plummeted, the cold marble of the floor seeming to tilt beneath my feet. "What is he doing here?" I asked, my voice sharp enough to make the assistant flinch. Jack looked up, adjusting his glasses. "Miss Harlow, please, come in. Mr. Mercer represents the line holder of your collateral property. He requested to be present for this meeting, as his client has a vested interest in the financial stability of the underlying asset. His client is my ex-husband," I said, stepping into the room. "And his client is the one who fraudulently triggered this foreclosure in the first place." Silas Mercer didn't even look up from his phone. "Careful with the word fraudulent, Iris. It implies a crime. My client simply decided he no longer wished to act as a guarantor on a $250,000 commercial loan. He exercised a legally binding demand clause. It's business, not personal." "It's entirely personal," I snapped, pulling out a chair. Kai sat down next to me, looking completely lost. Declan remained standing, positioned just behind my right shoulder, his presence a heavy, silent anchor in the room. Jack cleared his throat. "Regardless of the personal dynamics, the bank's position is strictly algorithmic. Your brother's restaurant loan is secured by the equity in the bakery building. Yesterday morning, a notice of default was officially recorded against that deed. Our system automatically froze the restaurant's operating accounts to mitigate the bank's exposure. So unfreeze them," Kai pleaded, leaning forward. "We have the cash flow. We had a sold-out opening night. I have reservations booked through November. We can make the monthly payments on the loan out of our operating revenue. Your cash flow is irrelevant if the underlying collateral is seized," Jack said, his tone perfectly flat, completely devoid of empathy. "The moment Oak Creek Holdings forecloses on 419 West Elm, your restaurant loan is in default. The bank will be forced to call the note in full." I looked at Silas. He was finally looking at me, a smug, relaxed smile resting on his lips. "Reed had sent him here specifically to watch us drown." "So that's it?" Kai asked, his voice cracking. "One automated alert and you shut down a business that hasn't even been open for 48 hours? You have a grace period," Jack said, shuffling a piece of paper across the table. "You have exactly 14 days to provide proof that the lien against the bakery has been cleared or refinanced. If you cannot produce a clean title by the 14th day, the accounts remain frozen, and the restaurant's assets will be liquidated to cover the bank's position." 14 days. Reed had given me 30 days on the bakery, but the bank was only giving Kai 14. Reed knew this. He knew the bank's covenants were tighter than the private loans. He was tightening the noose so fast I couldn't even catch my breath. "We need a temporary release of funds," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Kai needs to pay his vendors today. If they don't deliver, he can't open for his first weekend. If he doesn't open, the business dies before the 14 days are even up. I cannot authorize a release of funds on a compromised account," Jack said, closing his folder. "I'm sorry, Miss Harlow, it's bank policy." "It's actually tortious interference," Declan said. The entire room went still. Silas Mercer's smug smile vanished, and he turned to look at the man standing behind me. Jack frowned, leaning back in his chair. "Excuse me?" Jack said. Declan stepped forward, placing both hands flat on the mahogany table and leaning into Jack's space. "You are freezing an operating account based on a notice of default that is currently the subject of an active fraud investigation. By doing so, you are artificially manufacturing a secondary default on the restaurant, which directly benefits the party who filed the initial lien." Silas let out a short, dismissive laugh. "There is no fraud investigation. That's a bluff." Declan didn't even look at Silas. He kept his eyes locked on Jack. "Yesterday afternoon, my office pulled the incorporation documents for Oak Creek Holdings LLC. We found that the primary managing member is a shell entity registered in Delaware, which is wholly owned by Pierce Whitfield, the same Pierce Whitfield who plays golf every Tuesday at the same country club as Reed Halvorson. We also found a series of emails, which we are currently subpoenaing, indicating that Mr. Halvorson and Mr. Whitfield colluded to trigger the demand clause for the express purpose of seizing the property below market value to develop luxury condos." I stared at Declan. He was lying. Or at least, he was bluffing about the subpoenas. Fletcher hadn't gotten that far yet, but Declan delivered the lie with such terrifying clinical precision that it sounded like absolute fact. "That is an absurd allegation," Silas said, but his voice had lost its relaxed, mocking edge. He sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the guy who is going to name First National Bank as a co-defendant in a $50 million civil suit if you don't unfreeze that restaurant's accounts," Declan said smoothly. He finally looked at Silas. "You want to play hardball, Mercer? Let's play. If you force this foreclosure, we will drag Oak Creek Holdings into discovery. We will depose Pierce Whitfield. We will open up every single land deal he's pushed through the zoning board in the last 5 years. Do you really think Whitfield wants the SEC digging through his shell companies just to help your client settle a petty divorce grudge?" The color drained completely out of Silas's face. Declan had hit the exact nerve he was aiming for. Real estate developers like Whitfield operated in the shadows. They didn't want messy, public litigation. Jack cleared his throat, suddenly looking extremely uncomfortable. "Mister, I didn't catch your name." "My name doesn't matter," Declan said. "What matters is that you have a choice, Jack. You can release $50,000 of operating capital to Kai Harlow today, so he can pay his vendors and keep his business running. Or you can leave the freeze in place, and I will have an injunction filed against this branch by noon, citing bad faith acceleration." Jack looked at Silas, clearly hoping the lawyer would jump in and invalidate the threat. But Silas was silent. He was staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, looking like a man who suddenly realized he had stepped on a landmine. "I can authorize a temporary, restricted release," Jack said said quietly, adjusting his tie again. $50,000, strictly for vendor payments and payroll. But the 14-day deadline stands. Miss Harlow, you clear the lien on the bakery in 2 weeks, or the restaurant goes into receivership. We'll take it, I said. Kai let out a breath that sounded like a sob, dropping his face into his hands. 10 minutes later, we were standing on the sidewalk outside the bank. The Chicago wind was whipping down the street, biting through my thin coat. Kai pulled me into a crushing hug. Thank you, he whispered into my hair. I don't know who this guy is, Iris, but thank you. Go pay your vendors, I said, pulling back and forcing a smile. Get back to the kitchen. I'll handle the rest. Kai nodded, shook Declan's hand with both of his, and practically ran down the street toward the L train. I stood on the sidewalk with Declan. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving a hollow, exhausting dread in its wake. We bought 14 days, I said, looking up at him. But you were bluffing. We don't have emails proving collusion. We can't actually subpoena them yet. We don't need subpoenas, Declan said, pulling his phone out of his pocket. He held the screen up so I could see it. It was a text message from Fletcher, received while we were sitting in the bank. It contained a single photo of a document, a tax filing from 2018. Oak Creek Holdings isn't entirely owned by Pierce Whitfield, Declan said, his voice dropping low so the passing pedestrians wouldn't hear. Whitfield owns 60%. The other 40% was seeded by an anonymous investor 5 years ago. I squinted at the screen, trying to read the tiny print on the tax document. Who? Reed, Declan said. The street noise seemed to completely vanish. What? Reed is the silent partner, Declan explained, his jaw tight. 5 years ago, while you were married, he invested $250,000 into Whitfield's shell company. He essentially bought his own debt. I felt physically sick. He didn't just co-sign the loan. He became the lender, which means, Declan said, looking me dead in the eye, that when you were negotiating your divorce settlement, Reed was hiding a massive, revenue-generating asset. He used marital funds to buy into a commercial real estate firm, and he didn't disclose it to the judge. That's illegal, I breathed. It's perjury, Declan corrected. And it means you don't just owe Oak Creek Holdings money, Iris, because marital assets were used to fund it. He paused, letting the weight of the reality settle over me. You own 20% of the company that's trying to destroy you. I had to reach out and grab the cold metal of a parking meter to keep my knees from buckling. The wind off Lake Michigan was freezing, but I felt entirely numb. I stared at the blurry photo on Declan's screen. The tiny black text on the 2018 tax schedule clearly listed Reed Halverson as a 40% equity partner in Oak Creek Holdings. He bought his own debt, I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He took our money, invested it in a shell company, and now he's using that same company to foreclose on me. How is that even possible? Because he's a narcissist who thinks he's smarter than everyone else in the room, Declan said, pocketing his phone. When you filed for divorce, you went through financial discovery, right? You both submitted sworn affidavits of your assets. Yes, we split the joint savings, I kept the bakery, he kept his pension, and I bought out his half of the equity in our house. He didn't list Oak Creek on his affidavit, Declan said. It wasn't a question. If he had, your divorce attorney would have flagged it, especially since the company held a lien on your family's property. He hid a massive revenue-generating asset. In the state of Illinois, lying on a financial affidavit during a divorce is perjury. And because marital funds were used to purchase the asset, you are legally entitled to half of his share. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to stop the street from spinning. So I own 20% of Oak Creek. Does that stop the foreclosure? Not automatically, Declan said, his voice dropping into that calm, clinical register. Oak Creek is still a separate legal entity, and the entity holds the note, but it gives us a weapon. If we file an emergency injunction claiming the foreclosure is being executed by a company built on hidden marital assets, a judge will freeze everything. The 30-day clock on the bakery stops. The 14-day clock on Kai's restaurant stops. Everything gets locked in a vault until the court sorts it out. Okay, I breathed, dropping my hands. Okay, let's call my divorce lawyer. Let's call Claire. She handled the settlement. Declan shook his head. No offense to Claire, but if she missed a $250,000 wire transfer in your joint accounts 5 years ago, she's not equipped for this. Silas Mercer will eat her alive. We need a litigator who specializes in forensic asset recovery. Someone who thrives on making arrogant men bleed. Who? Vivian Strand, Declan said. She was outside counsel for my old firm. She charges $800 an hour. Her office is in the Willis Tower, and she has exactly zero bedside manner. I don't have $800 an hour, I reminded him. I told you, Declan said, stepping off the curb and raising a hand to flag a passing taxi. You're on retainer. Get in the car, Iris. We rode to the Willis Tower in silence. The sheer scale of the building, the polished granite lobby, the express elevator shooting up to the 64th floor. All of it felt like walking onto a battlefield wearing a paper armor. I was a baker. I spent my mornings covered in flour, arguing with vendors about the price of wholesale butter. I did not belong in the glass-walled corridors of Strand & Associates. Vivian Strand didn't keep us waiting. Her assistant ushered us straight into a corner office that smelled like expensive green tea and leather. Vivian was in her late 40s, wearing a tailored cream suit, her dark hair cut in a razor-sharp bob. She didn't stand up when we walked in. She just looked at Declan over the rim of her glasses. You look awful, Declan, she said, her voice dry and perfectly modulated. I heard you quit the firm to go play arm candy for lonely socialites. Midlife crisis? Something like that, Declan said, pulling out a chair for me before sitting down himself. This is Iris Harlow. She needs a temporary restraining order on a commercial foreclosure, and she needs it filed by Friday. Vivian raised an eyebrow, shifting her gaze to me. It felt like being scanned by an X-ray machine. Friday is in 4 days. Why the rush? Declan didn't wait for me to stumble through it. He laid it out with surgical precision. The bakery, the private loan, the demand clause, the restaurant collateral, and finally, the tax document Fletcher had pulled, showing Reed's 40% stake in Oak Creek Holdings. Vivian Vivian listened in absolute silence. She didn't take notes. When Declan finished, she reached out and tapped a gold pen against her immaculate mahogany desk. "It's sloppy," Vivian said, almost sounding offended by Reed's methodology. "Hiding an asset in a Delaware shell is basic, but routing it into a company that holds the debt on your ex-wife's property? That's not just greedy. That's vindictive. He wanted to own you. Can you stop the foreclosure?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "I can," Vivian said, leaning back in her chair. "But there's a problem, Iris. To get an emergency injunction in Cook County within 4 days, circumstantial evidence isn't enough. A blurry tax document texted by an analyst proves Oak Creek exists, and it proves Reed is a partner. But to prove he committed perjury in your divorce, we need the exact point of origin." "What does that mean?" "It means," Vivian explained, "I need to prove exactly where the $250,000 came from. I need a bank statement, a wire transfer confirmation, or a routed check from 2018 showing marital funds leaving your possession and entering Oak Creek's accounts. If Reed used an offshore account, or a trust you didn't know about, a judge won't grant an emergency freeze. We'd have to go through standard discovery, which takes 6 months. You'll lose the bakery and the restaurant before we even get a court date." I stared at her, my heart sinking. I don't have his old bank statements. During the marriage, we had one joint checking account for household bills, but he kept his own accounts at Chase for his consulting income. He never gave me the logins. I didn't even know his passwords. "Then we can't file the injunction," Vivian said plainly, dropping the gold pen. "Unless you have a way to magically produce a 5-year-old bank statement by tomorrow morning, Silas Mercer is going to foreclose on your building, and there is absolutely nothing I can do to stop him." The office went silent. The faint hum of the city traffic 64 stories below felt like white noise filling my skull. We had the motive, we had the shell company, but without the receipt, it was useless. I thought about the dusty banker's boxes sitting on my living room floor. None of Reed's personal accounts were in there. I thought about the bakery office. Nothing. And then, a memory hit me so hard it physically knocked the breath out of my lungs. "Petra," I whispered. Declan looked at me. "The mistress?" "She wasn't just his mistress," I said, my pulse suddenly racing. "Before she did the filing at the bakery, she was living with him. For the last 6 months of my marriage, while we were separated, she was organizing his life. And this morning, she walked into my bakery and told me she left him because he's a monster." Vivian leaned forward, suddenly interested. "Does she have his financial records?" "I don't know," I said, pulling out my phone. "But if she packed a bag and ran this morning, she didn't just take her clothes. If you're leaving a man like Reed, you take leverage." I didn't have Petra's phone number, but I had spent the first 3 months of my separation obsessively looking at her Instagram, torturing myself with photos of her in the SUV that was bought with my savings. I opened the app, my hands shaking, and typed her handle into the search bar. Petra_Pilates. Her profile was still public. I hit the message button and started typing. "I know you left him. I know about Oak Creek. Reed is going to destroy my brother's restaurant by Friday. If you actually want to prove you're not the person he turned you into, meet me. Today. Name the place." I hit send. We sat in Vivian's office for 10 agonizing minutes. Declan watched the window. Vivian answered 2 emails. I just stared at the little paper airplane icon on my screen, praying for the Reed receipt to appear. At 11:14 a.m., the screen pinged. "Petra, the diner on Halsted and 14th, 12:30. Come alone." I stood up. "She'll meet me." "Don't go alone," Declan said instantly, pushing himself out of his chair. "She specifically asked me to," I said. "If I show up with you, she'll bolt. She's terrified of Reed, and right now, you look like a corporate hitman. I need her to talk to me. Just me." Declan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just nodded. "I'll sit 3 booths down. I won't interfere unless I have to. But you aren't doing this without backup." Vivian picked up her pen again. "Get the account number, Iris. Get the routing data. If you bring me the proof by 9 a.m. tomorrow, I'll have the injunction filed before Silas Mercer even finishes his morning coffee." The diner on Halsted was a relic. Cracked vinyl booths, the smell of old fryer grease, and fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets. I walked in at exactly 12:28. Declan had entered 2 minutes before me, slipping into a booth near the back by the restrooms, his face buried in a laminated menu. I saw Petra sitting in a corner booth near the window. She was still wearing the beige trench coat from this morning. She had a mug of black coffee in front of her, and her hands were wrapped around it so tightly her knuckles were white. I slid into the booth across from her. She flinched, looking past me toward the door, checking to see if anyone had followed me. "He's at work," I said quietly, keeping my hands on the table. "He's not here, Petra." She looked back at me, her eyes bloodshot. Up close, she looked completely exhausted. The polished, 25-year-old fitness instructor who had clung to Reed's arm at the restaurant launch was gone. "I blocked his number," she whispered. "He's called me 40 times from Silas Mercer's office. He knows I took the laptop." My heart gave a massive, violent kick against my ribs. "You took his laptop?" "The personal one," Petra said, her voice shaking. "He kept it in his home office. When he was drinking last night, screaming about how you humiliated him, he kept saying he was going to burn you to the ground. He said he had the paperwork to take everything. When he finally passed out, I went into the office. I wanted to see what he was actually doing." She reached down into the canvas tote bag by her feet and pulled out a sleek silver MacBook. She slid it across the sticky Formica table toward me. "I don't know the password to log in," she said, "but he has a habit of leaving his documents folder open when he puts it to sleep. I opened it this morning. Iris, it's all in there. The emails with Pierce Whitfield, the Oak Creek tax filings." I stared at the closed aluminum lid of the laptop, the key to saving my family, sitting right in front of my face. "Do you know where the money came from?" I asked, looking up at her. "The $250,000 he used to buy into the company in 2018. My lawyer needs to prove it was marital funds. Do you know which account he used?" Petra's face crumbled. She looked down at her coffee mug, a tear slipping down her cheek and splashing onto the vinyl table. "It wasn't a bank account, Iris, she whispered. I frowned. What do you mean? I was his bookkeeper for 3 years, Petra said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the diner's refrigerators. I saw the transfer history. I saw the origination documents. He didn't use savings to buy into Oak Creek. She reached across the table, her trembling fingers brushing the edge of the laptop. In 2018, Petra said, Reed took out a second mortgage, a home equity line of credit, for exactly $250,000. The air left my lungs. A helic? I said, my voice cracking. On what house? On your house, Petra said, her eyes filled with a sickening, profound pity. The one in Oak Park. The one you lived in. That's impossible, I said, shaking my head, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of my neck. The house was in both of our names. He couldn't take out a second mortgage without my signature. The bank requires both owners to sign in front of a notary. He forged your signature, Iris, Petra said softly. He used an online e-notary service and uploaded a digital copy of your driver's license. He pulled the equity out of your home, wired it to Pierce Whitfield, and hid the debt in a separate Chase account. I felt violently ill. The diner walls seemed to warp and bend. When we divorced, I had fought tooth and nail to keep that house. Reed had demanded a massive buyout for his half of the equity. I had taken a secondary loan from the bakery's operating account just to pay Reed his share so I wouldn't have to move. He double-dipped. He stole $250,000 of equity from our home without telling me. He used it to buy the company that was now foreclosing on my bakery. And then, during the divorce, he made me pay him for the exact same equity he had already secretly drained. I had literally financed my own destruction. He's a monster, I whispered, staring blindly at the laptop. I can testify, Petra said, her voice frantic, desperate for absolution. I'll go to court. I'll tell the judge I saw the digital notary logs. I'll tell them everything. Before I could answer, the bell above the diner door jingled loudly. I didn't turn around, but I saw Petra's eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated terror. The color vanished from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. A heavy hand clamped down onto my shoulder, the fingers digging painfully into my collarbone. Well, Reed's voice hissed right next to my ear, smelling of stale mints and expensive cologne. Isn't this a touching little intervention? I didn't scream. I didn't even flinch. For 10 years, that voice, that specific tone of condescending amusement, had been the trigger that made me fold into myself. It was the sound that meant I was about to be corrected, minimized, or mocked. But sitting here in a greasy diner on Halsted, with the silver MacBook resting on the Formica table between me and the woman he had used to orchestrate my ruin, I didn't feel small. I just felt a cold, absolute clarity. Reed's hand tightened on my shoulder. I reached up, gripped his wrist, and physically removed his hand from my coat. He laughed, a short, breathy sound of disbelief, and slid into the booth next to me, trapping me against the window. He didn't even look at me. His eyes were locked on Petra. You are incredibly stupid, Reed said to her, his voice low and vicious. Did you really think I wouldn't track the location on that laptop? Hand it over, now, before I call the police and have you arrested for theft. Petra shrank back against the vinyl seat, her eyes darting toward the door. She looked like she was about to bolt. I placed my hands flat on the closed lid of the laptop. She didn't steal it, Reed. She brought it to me. Because it contains the proof that you committed wire fraud, identity theft, and perjury. Reed finally looked at me. His expression was a mask of pure arrogance. Iris, please, you're embarrassing yourself. You don't even know what you're talking about. You're in over your head as usual. Stick to baking muffins and let the adults handle the real estate. He reached across the table to grab the laptop. Before his fingers could even brush the aluminum, a large, heavy hand clamped down on his wrist. Reed yanked his arm back, startled, and looked up. Declan was standing right beside our booth. He had moved so quietly I hadn't even heard him approach. The adults are handling it, Declan said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a lethal, icy weight that made the hair on my arms stand up. Move over. Reed glared at him. Who the hell are you? The rented boyfriend? Back off before I have you thrown out. Move over, Declan repeated, not breaking eye contact. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't have to. The sheer physical presence of him, the absolute lack of hesitation in his posture, made Reed hesitate. Slowly, angrily, Reed slid out of the booth and stood up in the narrow aisle. Declan didn't sit down. He stood facing Reed, completely blocking his path to the table. Here is exactly what is going to happen, Reed, Declan said, his tone entirely conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. You are going to take your phone out of your pocket. You are going to call Silas Mercer. And you are going to instruct him to immediately withdraw the notice of default on 419 West Elm. Reed let out a harsh, barking laugh. Are you insane? I'm not withdrawing anything. I own that debt. She defaults on Friday. You don't own the debt, I said, sliding out of the booth and standing next to Declan. I looked Reed dead in the eye. You forged my signature on an e-notary platform in 2018 to take out a $250,000 helic on the Oak Park house. You stole my equity, wired it to Pierce Whitfield, and hid the asset during our divorce. The smug, mocking smile on Reed's face completely vanished. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sallow and suddenly very old under the fluorescent diner lights. You have absolutely no proof of that, Reed stammered, but his voice lacked its usual bite. He glanced at the laptop. I'm the proof, Petra said. Her voice was shaking, but she stood up, stepping out of the booth to face him. I did your books, Reed. I saw the digital notary logs. I saw the wire transfers to Whitfield. I will swear to it in a deposition. I will hand this laptop directly to a forensic accountant. I'm done covering for you. Reed stared at her, genuine panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. He looked at me, then at Declan. You can't use any of that. It's stolen property. We don't have to use it in court, Declan said smoothly. We just have to hand it to Vivian Strand. She's outside counsel for my former firm. Once she files the emergency injunction citing forged marital assets, the judge will freeze the foreclosure. Then, the court will subpoena Pierce Whitfield. How do you think Whitfield is going going to react when he finds out you used his shell company to launder stolen home equity? Do you think he's going to protect a food critic? Or do you think he's going to throw you to the federal prosecutors to save his own real estate license? Reed opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time in the 10 years I had known him, Reed Halverson was entirely speechless. He was doing the math in his head, watching the walls close in on him in real time. Call Silas, I said. My voice was steady. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. Tell him to withdraw the default. Then tell him to draft a complete release of the lien on the bakery and a transfer of your 40% equity in Oak Creek Holdings to me as restitution for the HELOC you stole. You sign it all over today, or we walk this laptop to the U.S. Attorney's office. You're extorting me, Reed whispered, his eyes wide. I'm recovering stolen property, I corrected. Make the call, Reed. You have 10 seconds before I pack up this laptop and leave. Reed stood there, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked at the diner door, calculating if he could grab the laptop and run. But Declan simply shifted his weight, completely blocking the exit. Slowly, with trembling hands, Reed reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number, put it to his ear, and turned away from us. Silas, Reed said, his voice entirely hollow. It's me. Pull the default on the Harlow Bakery. Yes, right now. Just do it. He paused, listening to Silas argue on the other end. I said do it, Silas, and draft a release of the lien. I'm transferring my stake in Oak Creek. He hung up the phone and turned back to us, his face twisted in a sneer of pure hatred. You're a miserable bitch, Iris. You always were. And you're just a critic, Reed, I said softly. You don't build anything. You just tear things down. Now get out of my sight. He looked at Petra one last time, a pathetic attempt at intimidation, but she just stared back at him with dead eyes. Reed turned on his heel and walked out of the diner, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the smell of old coffee and fryer grease. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for a decade. My knees suddenly felt weak, and I had to put a hand on the table to steady myself. Petra reached over, closed the laptop, and pushed it toward me. Keep it. Give it to your lawyer. Make sure he actually signs the papers. Where are you going to go? I asked her. My sister lives in Denver, Petra said, picking up her canvas tote bag. I have a flight at 3. I'm going to start over. Somewhere that doesn't have him in it. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. She gave me a small, sad smile, pulled her trench coat tight, and walked out the door. I stood there staring at the silver aluminum of the laptop. The $250,000 hanging over my head was gone. Kai's restaurant was safe. The bakery was completely mine. Declan picked up the laptop and tucked it under his arm. He looked at me, his expression softening into something entirely different from the cold enforcer he had just played. You did that. You didn't even blink. I had a good buffer, I said, the corners of my mouth finally turning up into a real smile. We walked out of the diner together. The Chicago wind was still sharp, but the gray clouds had broken, letting bright, hard sunlight wash over the brick buildings. The city looked different. Brighter, whiter so, Declan said as we reached the corner. You have a bakery to run, and I think I'm technically still on retainer. Do you accept unpaid internships? I laughed, a real, full laugh that started in my chest and echoed down the street. Only if you can properly sand a mahogany table. I'm a fast learner, he said. We turned down Halsted, walking back toward the West Loop, back toward the smell of yeast and roasting coffee. For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking to make room for anyone else. I was just walking into my own life, taking up exactly as much space as I deserved.